Hello, this is Alan Wheeler recording another lecture for the online English 1102 class, Literature and Composition. The topic for this lecture is Counter Perspective and the short story by Amy Tan, A Pair of Tickets. And just as before, I want to look at a general concept or tool that can be applied to any work of literature. Although we'll apply it to this story, you could apply it to almost anything you read. And by way of introduction, the topic we're looking at is counter perspective, and this is the idea of seeing an experience or idea from another viewpoint, from another point of view or perspective. And this, I'll use the St. Martin's Handbook to begin. In Chapter 8 of the 7th edition, I believe it's in Chapter 11 of the 6th, in the chapter Critical Thinking and Argument, there's a section about thinking critically, and the editor suggests playing the believing and doubting game. Here's what they write. Critical thinkers are able to shift stances as they take in an argument, allowing them to gain different perspectives. One good way to begin is to play the believing game. Put yourself in the position of the person creating the argument. See the topic from that person's point of view. Secondly, play the doubting game, looking skeptically at each claim and examining each piece of evidence to see how well it supports the claim. And so, asking questions, thinking critically, seeing how would a person who doesn't believe this idea consider it? How does someone who does believe it consider it? That's basically, from a logical perspective, the idea of counterpoint or counter perspective. There's another chapter in the St. Martin's Handbook, Chapter 24 in the 7th edition, called Writing to the World. This is on page 502. I believe it's page 504 in the 6th edition. But this chapter discusses cross-cultural communication, and the passage I want to highlight is in the beginning, and the editors urge readers to think about what seems normal. They write that it's likely that your judgment on what's normal is based on assumptions you are not even aware of. So, many of us are culture bound, and we don't know that we have these underlying assumptions. And so this chapter brings out that important idea of audience analysis, considering how multiple perspectives might come into play, and in this case, cross-cultural ones. There's two proverbs that illustrate this idea nicely. One is, I'll paraphrase this, the first proverb: if you want to understand what water is, don't ask the fish. If you want to understand what water is, don't ask the fish. And this means that although the fish lives in the water, breathes the water, is surrounded by the water, the fish may not be aware of the water, because the fish has nothing to contrast that with, has no counterpoint, no counter perspective. Ask the cat, who tries to get the fish and gets splashed by the water and doesn't like the water. The cat will be more aware of the element of water. It's wet, it's cold, and other characteristics. So to actually get outside of the fishbowl and look at it from a counter perspective will bring more understanding. The second proverb is a Chinese one, which fits in well with the short story we're looking at, being Chinese. And the Chinese proverb is this: the man on the mountain cannot see the mountain, So it's the same idea that the man who lives on the mountain has no counter perspective. He doesn't really understand. He must actually walk a distance away from the mountain and look back, and then he will see on the horizon emerging the huge mountain, and by way of contrast, he can understand it. So this is very, very similar to the concept people sometimes espouse when they say you never really understand your country till you go away and live abroad for a year and then come back. And then you can truly appreciate and understand your own culture because you have a counter perspective. So in this short story, A Pair of Tickets, because the author is Chinese American, and because the one of the central ideas in the story is the trip to China, which is why it's included in this chapter on setting, we see dramatized this idea of counter perspective. And we see it right from the beginning in the story as the narrator talks about leaving on a train from the Hong Kong border to enter China. This is back when Hong Kong was not a part of China yet. And the narrator says immediately she feels different. And she thinks, oh, my mother was right, I am becoming Chinese. So the setting and her identity are coming into play here. She writes in the second paragraph, my Caucasian friends agreed I was about as Chinese as they were. But her mother had told her once that you are born Chinese, you cannot help but feel and think Chinese. And again, the issue of identity comes out as a focus here in the beginning. Looking in paragraph 5, the narrator says, but today I realize I've never really known what it means to be Chinese. So this is a key issue in the story. And upon actually going to China, the narrator has lived in America as an American Chinese, but only in going to China and getting this counter perspective does she come to understand who she is, her identity, her own culture, and some other things. So I want to take a few minutes because I've lived in China and spent more than 10 years there. Many of the details in the story stand out to me, and I just want to go through and point out some of these. Some of them are culture stress, some are examples of culture shock, and some just cultural differences, just physical differences in the two places, America and China. But I want to pull out some of these to highlight this idea of counter perspective and then conclude, expand on that a little bit in conclusion. But I've just highlighted quite a few things that stood out to me with my experience with the Chinese culture. Many of these things, if you watch the movie The Joy Luck Club, which was based on Amy Tan's novel, which grew from the seed of this very short story, A Pair of Tickets, you'll get a lot more examples of the culture stress, culture shock, and cultural differences. But there's quite a few just in this short story. Here's an example. I'm looking on page 124, and we see she's calling, she's in her imagination, she's creating a scene, and she writes, like my mother. It would have been like my mother to bring mountains of gifts, food and toys for children, all bought on sale, shunning thanks, saying the gifts were nothing. and later turning the labels over to show my sisters, Calvin Klein, 100% wool. Now, it might be easy to read past this if you're not familiar with some of the deep-rooted things in the Chinese culture, especially the ideas about giving gifts and how that's different from our Western American way of giving gifts. But if you're familiar with the Chinese culture, this is quite funny. First of all, it's a custom. If you travel, you must bring back gifts. If you're coming to someone's home even, it's often an Asian custom to bring a small token. And giving a nice gift gives face to the giver. This is something we, for example, in my family, we always took the price tag off the gifts. Sometimes we had the secret Santa, so that it wasn't important who gave the gift, that there was no strings attached to the gift. And this is very different in the Chinese culture, where it's a duty of the giver. It brings honor and face to the giver of the gift. And there's an idea of reciprocity. Just as revenge is a classic stereotype of some Asian cultures, even doing good things needs to be paid back. And so there's almost never something given without strings in the traditional culture. And so here, even though in the imagination of the narrator these things were bought on sale, yet it was very important for the mother to say, look how good they are, 100% wool. And yet at the same time to deprecate, to show humility and modesty. Oh, no, the gifts are nothing. This is very funny if you know the Chinese culture, just to read these few lines. Another example of Chinese thinking, deep in much Asian culture, is the idea of filial piety and the duty owed to one's family, especially from children to parents. And I believe it's even still the law in China that children must take care of their parents in their old age. They can be fined or imprisoned sometimes if they don't take care of their parents, something that's not always a part of American culture. But deep, this duty to parents shows up in about paragraph 30. When the narrator is worried, they'll think, in the paragraph before, they'll think I'm responsible that she died because I didn't appreciate her, thinking about her mother. Paragraph 30. And Auntie Lindo looked satisfied and sad at the same time, as if this were true, and I had finally realized it. It might be hard for Americans to empathize with this emotion, that she would be shamed that the death of her mother could be her fault, that she hadn't done something here, that she didn't appreciate her enough, and that others around her, her Auntie Lindo, shared that. Yes, you should have realized that. That's something that's rooted in a different culture, in a different perspective. A little bit more superficially, going to the bottom of page 124, she's describing the scene in China and the change in her own heart. And she said, I am in China, I remind myself, and somehow the crowds don't bother me. It feels right. I start pushing too. And so living in China, one immediately becomes accustomed to huge crowds and crowding on the buses in the stores, and it feels very natural to her right away. She even starts pushing. So if you have to get on a bus in China, there's little old ladies jabbing you in the side. There's a swarm of people trying to get on. The competition is very fierce for any space while they're on the road or in a store. And so this is typical of China, very different in the more wide expanses of American towns. Another example is on page 127, she describes the taxi driver. And this is about paragraph 59, when she says, "I am now holding my breath as the taxi driver dodges between trucks and buses, honking his horn constantly. I can now see row after row of apartments, each floor cluttered with laundry hanging out to dry on the balcony. We pass a public bus with people jammed in so tight their faces are nearly wedged against the window. She sees high-rises and construction going on everywhere, scaffolding made of bamboo poles held together with plastic strips. She sees men and women standing on narrow platforms, scraping the sides of the building, working without safety straps or helmets. Oh, would OSHA have a field day here, I think." And so the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, with all the regulations in America, of course, has no jurisdiction there. And when I lived in China during my 10 years, there was often a different kind of code, wires hanging into the sidewalks, open manholes as we walked along. And the responsibility was for each person to be safe and careful. And it wasn't so much of a public code at that time, at the time when I lived there, or at the time of the writing of this story. But this is a culture shock for her to, in her case, she's feeling at home, and it feels natural and normal to her, and she's getting a sense of her Chinese identity in this story. In my case, of course, it was culture shock and getting a perspective of my own culture. There's all kinds of little things, the shampoo packets that she sees in the hotel. More to the point, really, she feels uncomfortable staying at the big 5-star hotel. She's afraid that she'll be seen as rich Americans who cannot be without luxuries even for one night. And that appears in paragraph 6, at the end of paragraph 62, at the top of page 128. "We rich Americans cannot be without our luxuries for even one night." And so she's very aware of the Chinese perception of Americans. And when we lived in China, people often assumed we were filthy rich. We must have lots of cars and houses back in America and have so much money, although we certainly did not feel like rich people living in China. And so that's a counter perspective. The story goes on, and she asks her father to tell the story of her mother to her in Chinese. She says, "I can understand. Really, I can understand the Chinese." And so she's identifying with her own language, her family's language, her family's background here through the story. There are allusions to Buddhism in the story. She talks about a Buddhist hell, and as her mother has to leave the babies, as she hears about that story. She hears about some of the superstitions. Muslims believe that twin babies were a sign of double luck. So there's a lot of, whether Muslim or Buddhist or ancestor worship, there's remnants of superstition in China of this kind, that two babies are a sign of double luck. And at the bottom of page 132, the father's telling the story. Maybe it was your mother's dead spirit who guided her Shanghai schoolmate to find her daughters. So this idea of a spiritual realm is very different than most modern Western views of that often have an anti-supernatural bias, or maybe a scientific view of the world, more in line with materialism and things. Well, there's many examples in the story. The big three differences between Chinese and American culture, I'll just tell you, are probably group harmony is much more important in Asian culture, whereas independence, individualism, self-reliance are more the focus in the West. Number two would be power distance. There's probably a greater idea of the traditional role of a leader, and the teacher being respected, the boss being revered, the authority of the parents and the father in the family, and things like that. That would be power distance. Whereas in the West, we have more of a democratic idea of equality. We're all equal, and egalitarian outlook on life. The third one would probably be faith, the idea of honor and gaining face and saving face, whereas many times in the West we don't have a focus on that. We wouldn't be ashamed of some of the things that would bring shame in Asian cultures. We would think more of maybe guilt for specific actions, and it would be more on the individual's ability, and less focus on perception by the group. Again, there's overlap in some of these because there's more formality in the Asian culture, and there's, because of some of these things, the face, the indirect, the group harmony, there will be a tendency to be more indirect. And so many things come into play. The modesty of the Chinese. But those are the big three: the faith, the power distance, and the group harmony being very important. Now, those are cultural counter-perspectives. And I mentioned that in concluding this lecture, I wanted to extend that a little more. And here's the question that brings that out. Following the story on page 134 in the textbook, question number 5 asks, in what ways does the story explore specifically Chinese American experiences? In what other ways is the story grounded in universal issues? And so that's what I want to look at, because not every story we read will deal specifically with cultural counter-perspective. So how does the idea of counter-perspective help us with any work of literature? Well, I would argue that one role of literature is to help us step outside of our own experience, step outside almost of our own humanity and look at it, almost like an alien from space would look. And that helps us to critically think about some of the things literature deals with, some of the issues. Faulkner said that literature is concerned with the struggle of the human heart with itself. Some people have said literature is about the human condition. And so some of these things, if this is one purpose of literature in the humanities, how do we step outside of ourselves to look at these things? Some of the universal issues in this story that anybody could grapple with would be a search for identity, whether you're Chinese American or Latin American or whatever your identity, that could be a universal issue, the search for it. Family issues, the struggle of grief and loss. And so many of the things that this story investigates are actually common to all humanity. So literature can provide a perspective different from our own. We have to step outside our own little life where we may be like that fish in the water or that man on the mountain, and where we don't really think about what we struggle with, what it means to be human, what life is, some of those big questions in life. And so one function of literature, and the editors of your textbook bring this up in the introduction to the textbook, that this is a function of literature to give us tools and a framework for thinking about life, and something that we might not get in our technical classes and in some of the other classes that we take. So this is maybe the largest view of counter perspective that literature can help us with. And so I will close there, and I hope you'll be able to apply this idea of stepping outside of the box and looking at the works of literature and the themes therein with a counter perspective. Thank you very much.